Hello everyone, Commonwealth Realm here. The Nintendo Switch 2 has been revealed in its entirety, and unsurprisingly, it is a huge upgrade, being 10 times as powerful as the original Switch according to Nvidia. Not only that, but it puts most PC handhelds like Steam Deck to shame. So we're going to go over in detail what makes this console better than its predecessor, and maybe one thing it doesn't excel in. Before we begin, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and press that notification bell to stay updated on more Switch 2 news up to its release on June 5th. Now let's start with the hardware, since this is the biggest leap in this next generation of bigger and better. Seeing that the Direct confirmed pretty much every leak, including the desktop mouse feature, it is quite a significant beef up compared to the Switch's measurements when we include the Joy-Cons. Same thinness as the 2017 original, but taller and wider. The main reason for this increase is in the display, 7.9 inches. The Nintendo Switch OLED has a 7-inch 720p OLED display, which was an upgrade from the 6.2-inch Switch LCD, both in color depth and vibrancy. The Nintendo Switch 2 doesn't have OLED, but it supports HDR, making the OLED almost unnecessary. It's also a 1080p Full HD display with a 120Hz refresh rate, making it possible to play games like Metroid Prime 4 Beyond at 120 FPS for quicker reaction times during combat. Needless to say, this display is far better than Switch 1's and even Switch OLEDs, and you know Nintendo is saving a Switch 2 OLED model for that mid-gen system upgrade. Moving over to the inside of the system. The Nintendo Switch 2 has been rumored to use a powerful custom Tegra T239 chip, being manufactured together with Samsung, but we haven't heard confirmation of this. All we know from Nintendo and Nvidia is that the chip is indeed custom and it supports an unspecified version of DLSS. This combined CPU and GPU system on a chip is claimed to be 10 times more powerful than Nintendo Switch's custom Tegra X1 SoC. It is fully capable of supporting most current-gen games including Cyberpunk 2077, Star Wars Outlaws, and Street Fighter 6, the latter of which even looks better than on Xbox Series S according to YouTuber Switchplayed. This isn't going to apply to every single Series S game playable on Switch 2, but it's impressive nonetheless. What's more is that third-party developers are claiming that Switch 2 is quite easy to develop for. Stephen Totilo from GameFile spoke to a few of these devs, such as the Civilization 7's executive producer Dennis Shirk, who said the console is like a mid-tier PC with enough power for modern games, and Nintendo made it easy with their software development kit along with customer and developer support. The developers of Hogwarts Legacy and Hades 2 had equally great things to say about Switch 2. This is such a far cry from the first Switch, as even though devs had good things to say about that, the games that were ported to this system were significantly compromised in visuals and performance. Safe to say, that's not going to happen to the same extent with Switch 2, at least in the first few years. One of the biggest leaps is hidden in the system's higher memory. The entire Nintendo Switch family of systems has 4GB of RAM, while the Switch 2 reportedly has 12GB. Of these, it's assumed that a little over 10GB will be available for games after the operating system has taken its share. This massive jump in fidelity should give us handheld performance above the PS4, which is good enough on a 1080p LCD screen, but the real magic is in the docked gameplay, in part due to the dock's cooling fan. It takes a lot of horsepower to run these games at 4K 60fps, so a fan like this is necessary to keep the system from overheating. Needless to say, I'm a fan of that.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
These specs will bring the visuals of Nintendo's own first-party titles to a whole new level. We're already seeing how great Mario Kart World looks at 4K, but Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom running at upscaled 4K 60fps is quite simply breathtaking.
This guy stinks!
Let's also not forget Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, as while it looks great on Switch 1, it's further improved on Switch 2 with two graphics options, 4K 60fps and 1080p at 120fps, the latter of which should be helpful while using mouse mode on the Joy-Con 2s. The Switch 2's increased power will not just help visuals, but other on-screen elements like the ones in Donkey Kong Bonanza, as the Switch 1 simply couldn't handle all those breakable objects. Games will also benefit from improved load speeds. The Nintendo Switch generation has been dependent on slower eMCC NAND flash memory, resulting in some obscenely long load times. Overclocking the system for these instances has helped, but it could not compare to the higher read speeds of SSD. The Nintendo Switch 2, on the other hand, has a built-in Samsung VNAND with 256GB of storage compared to 32 on the basic Switch and 64 on the OLED, and much better UFS 3.1 2100 400 megabits per second speeds. That is only a slightly slower read speed than on Xbox Series and PS5. 256 gigabytes is a big jump in storage, but we should be aware that next-gen titles are likely to be bigger and take up more space. Right now, the download sizes are reasonable, like Mario Kart World being 23.4 gigs and Donkey Kong Bonanza being only 10, but the next open-air Zelda might not be 18 gigabytes but around 30. In other words, 256 gigabytes might be the bare minimum yet again. We will still likely be dependent on our micro SD cards to store games. Fortunately, most of us already own spacious cards, but some of us will need to buy micro SD Express cards, as these will be fully supported with their nearly 10 times higher speed. Thankfully, some games will be available on their carts, like Cyberpunk 2077, taking up the entirety of its 64GB cartridge with no additional install required. Hopefully, other developers take note. With that being said, when docked, there is no real point comparing the successor to the original, so let's move over to the undocked experience, which most players in Japan and travelers are more interested in anyway. And here, after covering the display, let's get into weight, since the Nintendo Switch 2 is by all indications heavier than the Nintendo Switch. It shouldn't come as a surprise with a bigger display. At the same time, it isn't a dramatic gain from the Switch OLED, which is slightly heavier than the regular Switch, and nothing will ever come close to the Switch Lite. The Switch OLED with Joy-Cons attached weighs 0.93 pounds or 420 grams, which was heavier than the Nintendo Switch weighing 0.88 pounds or 398 grams, and the Lite is 276. For Switch 2, it's 1.18 pounds or 535 grams with the Joy-Con 2s attached. Now before we move to the sides, let's have a look at the bottom, since Nintendo is sticking to USB-C, the universal charging format, though also for the dock signal to HDMI. So are there any differences to the battery charger? Apparently yes, in the voltage, and that changes everything. From 39 watts, where only a maximum of 18 has been utilized, to 60 watts for the Nintendo Switch 2's charger. You would probably increase this by 20 to offer greater charging spec to push the system even further, in particular when docked for DLSS or lightning charging, a standard for all smartphones these days. When it comes to battery life, that's the only thing about Switch 2 that's worse than Switch 1, as its battery lasts approximately 2 to 6.5 hours depending on the games you play, despite it being bigger than the Switch and Switch OLED's battery. Even still, those older consoles last between 4.5 to 9 hours. This is definitely the result of running more graphically intensive games like Metroid Prime 4. All the more reason to take a charger or battery pack with you on those trips. We expect this battery life to improve with later models of Switch 2, as the same thing happened with Switch 1, when the first few years' models only had 3 to 6 hours of battery life. Now let's go from the bottom of the system to the back. The Switch's original kickstand was sadly an unstable mess with one standing position. The Switch OLED's wide adjustable stand and the Switch 2's evolved U-shaped handle, on the other hand, allow you to play in whatever angle you prefer. Freedom of play reaches a whole other level with the Nintendo Switch 2, while compromising nothing compared to what we are used to on the Switch OLED model. Add to that, we have a microphone used for the game chat system, as well as in games like Super Mario Party Jamboree TV. Moving to the side, and the controllers included in the base price. The button layout and size of the Nintendo Switch 2 Joy-Con 2s are bigger. What is more, they are attached magnetically on the sides. This all stands in contrast to the Switch OLED and Switch Basic with on-rails detachable Joy-Cons. Add to that Nintendo Switch 2 having a new C button under the Home button. And while the control sticks are not Hall effect, they were built from the ground up for Switch 2, suggesting they may be less prone to drift than the Switch 1 Joy-Cons. At least we hope. Before we conclude this comparison, we want to see how Switch 2 stacks up to handheld gaming PCs, namely the Steam Deck and Steam Deck OLED. There are dozens of other handheld PCs with theoretically better specs than Switch 2, but they cost way more, are significantly heavier, and don't come with a TV dock. The Steam Decks are the most affordable comparison to Switch 2, and even they have some drawbacks. Their screens are smaller at 7 to 7.4 inches with only an 800p resolution. The Steam Deck LCD has a 60Hz refresh rate, and the OLED has 90Hz. With Nvidia confirming Switch 2 supports DLSS and ray tracing, it makes the Steam Deck look even less appealing, as it doesn't support either, at least not without completely modding the systems. Make no mistake, you're getting much better bang for your buck with Switch 2 as opposed to Steam Deck. All signs from hands-on preview events show that third parties are already taking great advantage of the system. It'll be exciting to see what's in store for Switch 2 in the coming months. So thank you for watching up until the very end. If you haven't already, then be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and press that notification bell to make this video more visible and help the channel grow. We have far more Nintendo Switch 2 videos in the works, so please look forward to them. But I want to thank all of our Patreon supporters, including Royal Producer JC Funk and heroes Cheryl, Garrett Hoy, Holly Wolf, and Kintaro. You're all awesome. So thanks for watching, and be sure to check out one or both of these awesome videos.